Welcome on Valentine's Day evening to all of you who are here live and those on Zoom. It's a great pleasure to welcome you. There is, for those folks here who are live, decaf coffee in the back and some chocolate chip cookies and some molasses ginger bars. So tonight, our purpose here is to link together last week's program, which was a heart experience of Confederate statues by having John C. Calhoun speak to us about his ideas and why the South would have put him up on a pedestal. Tonight, we are joining that with the head, if you will, with knowledge, facts, as well as a look at some values. Values, when they're out in public, are politics. So there is, if you listen to the tape of the Charleston council meeting, someone there who made a really articulate point about that he never learned anything from a statue, didn't learn history from a statue. I ask you tonight, as we hear Mike Nagle speak to us about the statues, what do we learn from statues? What do you learn? We probably each learn something different. And if you haven't viewed the performance of Brick Plummer from last week, please go online and listen to it. It's wonderful. And also then think about that as, you know, think when you watch it, what you hear tonight. The program is funded by the Minnesota Humanities Council, as well as Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs. We are grateful for their funding. We also thank the library for its support and contributions and with staffing and funds. Also, we have our team, three of us here tonight. Kathy Organ has been providing the brochures, the pamphlets for tonight, and Thomas Trahey runs the tech. I'm Brooke Portman. Somebody once said, I've never identified myself about what I do, except for maybe on occasion. So I have spent my first 30 years in the arts. The last 20 years were in higher ed. I am now retired and doing the love of my life through both of those 50 years of journeying of programming. Next week, so we will have someone speak about the white women of the South and what was their role in the white power movement, in white supremacy. It's an amazing story that we will hear next week. So that's a little heads up then. Today's quote, I won't read it to you. It's on the documents. It's an exuberant celebration, I thought, perfect for Valentine's Day, of a love for many races, many people, many cultures. The speaker tonight is Mike Nagle. He was here last week. You found probably, I'm hoping as I did, he's a great facilitator. And I think tonight you'll find him to be an even more fabulous teacher speaker. Mike's little bio is, just brief bio, is he has a BA and an MA from Western Washington University, located in Washington State. His BA is in education and his MA is in history. He has a biography out of Justice S. Stearns, and he has another book coming out on Eber Brock Ward, also from Michigan. When he died in 1875, that man was the wealthiest man in Michigan. Another couple other things about Mike is that he has been twice elected to serve on the Ludington School Board. We all ought to thank him in these times. Great, the fan club here, Mike. He is also a presenter at many, and you will see why, at many conferences in addition to his teaching, both academic conferences and public conferences and professional association conferences. I have to say this week too, he is the very proud father of two grown daughters who are, as I said, two adult daughters who are grown, graduated, and earning their own keep. And a shout out to Mike's wife, Buffy, because she is the one who said it's okay for Mike to be here tonight instead of for them to do their annual Valentine's Day dinner. I do know, folks, she is the love of his life. So please, a warm welcome to Mike Nagle for his return and to talk to us about the Confederate statues of the South. Mike, welcome.
Well, thank you so much, and I really appreciate you being here on a very cold, snowy evening. So I really appreciate it. And it's kind of interesting. So I talked to my wife, what, 6 months ago or something like that, when Brooke asked me to speak. And I said, well, maybe we can celebrate, you know, the night before or something like that. So Saturday, we had dinner and a movie. We saw Death on the Nile, and it was really a lot of fun. And then we went out to dinner, and then tonight, I thought, you know, we could just have leftovers or something like that. And she had sous vide a steak. I don't know if you've ever had that before. It's a little bit different. You kind of boil it, and it's at a particular temperature. And I was just like, oh my gosh, because I knew that you know I would have to be here tonight. So that was really neat. But anyway, thank you so much, and I appreciate you being here. You can go ahead and put up the PowerPoint. One thing too is like with my daughters. Oh shoot, what was I going to say? I know at least one teacher here and others. One daughter's in Colorado, and she's a teacher. She's teaching ESL, and she's in her first year. And then my other daughter is going to reopen her cake business very soon. She had it out of our house. So anyway, if you're looking for a cake. So yes. So so what I'd like to do tonight is I'd like to talk a little bit about the Confederate flag and Confederate monuments, and maybe, you know, one thing is that the students in my classes supposedly want to be there because it's college. But still they're required. And it's just so nice to have a group that came out tonight. So again, thank you to you. All right. And I was wondering if this was gonna work because this is such a long distance. So Tom, I may need, yeah, it looks like you're gonna have to. So if you go ahead and go to the next slide. Sure. Okay. Oh, there we go. So I'm going to come back to this a couple of times, but this whole issue of the Confederacy, Confederate flag, Confederate monuments, it's complicated. And I say that for many reasons, because many of these statues, many of these items, they're archival items. And so simply removing them, I'm uncomfortable with that. Although I'm also uncomfortable with the presentation of them. So it can be very complicated. But two questions I'd like you to keep in mind is, who was in power when the monument was put into place? That's one thing to keep in mind, okay? Who or what group? And why is it there, okay? What was the monument's purpose? What was its message? What were they trying to convey when they established it? And so if we look at things historically, okay, and so maybe actually just go ahead and hit that space bar. All right, so I mean, if we look back in the past, if you go to Rome and if you go to the Colosseum, you will walk right past the Arch of Constantine, a Roman emperor. It's an awesome sight to see. And listed on those, or I should say represented on that arch. These triumphal arches were very common in Roman communities. Were a series of battles and all the great things that Constantine did during his reign. They didn't have 30-second commercials to talk about how great they were. And so they built these monuments to send a message. And anyone going to the Colosseum would have to walk right past this. On the right, we see, from a later era, okay, so, over 1,000 years later, we've got in Paris, we've had the Arc de Triomphe, or the Arch of Triumph, where Napoleon did the same thing. He repeated a piece of architecture that was very common from the Roman era, where he did the same thing, and he's glorifying himself. And there are images on that, if you get close to it, like where there's a deity, where Napoleon is actually presented in part of like he might be a deity, and that. Go ahead, Thomas, if you can hit the next. Upper left, we've got Abraham Lincoln, and he's larger than life. If you ever go to Washington, D.C., I'm sure many of you have probably been there. And then if you're at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, you can look across the reflecting pool to the Washington Monument. And on the right, the Vietnam War Memorial that many of us have probably seen. One thing that was really interesting when I went, if you see the one on the top, okay, I think everyone knows, and I expected to see the names of the fallen men and women from the Vietnam War. But if you notice, the names are actually kind of underground in a way, like if you see the hill, so it's built into the hill. So many of them did not have their bodies did not have a final resting place. And so here the artist has conveyed this. And so finally, maybe there's a settling of this and you could come to some peace. And also, if you look at the bottom, and if you get very close to the wall, there's a reflection in it, and you can see yourself in it. You can see all the names, but then there's a reflection. So maybe everyone was impacted or has been impacted by the Vietnam War, and therefore we're all part of this memorial to those fallen men and women. Go ahead, Thomas, if you can hit the next. I suspect you might have hit okay, all right. So I don't know if you've ever been to Plymouth Rock. Boy, that was sure a disappointment. So I was so excited to see Plymouth Rock. And I was like, oh, there it is. And I was with my daughters and they were young. And because there's the big, kind of a monument around it. And then I was like, oh, that's it. And then it was like they moved it and it broke. And you can see that it was broken. And then again, at Arlington National Cemetery, we have the Eternal Flame with John F. Kennedy. And what's interesting is that Kennedy actually had been to Gettysburg prior to his death, maybe 6 months, something like that. And he was very impressed by it. And when President Kennedy was assassinated, Jackie said, you know what, maybe we can do something similar here at his final resting place, because he had liked the Gettysburg Eternal Flame. And so we have that. And I don't know if how many of you have been to DC in Arlington? Okay. And if you go right around there, Bobby Kennedy's final resting place is there, and it's just a simple wooden cross. And so that's kind of neat too, reflecting the two brothers. So go ahead, if you can hit the next. One, newer memorial, I don't know, from 25 years ago, maybe something like that, 20 years ago, is the Franklin Roosevelt Memorial. And it's really neat if you could, and it tells the story of the Great Depression and the New Deal and some of the government programs. But it was interesting because there was kind of an outcry, just like, wait a minute, we can't tell that President Roosevelt was confined to a wheelchair. That was not included in the original memorial. And so the one on the bottom right was eventually added. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there's maybe only a handful of photos that were taken of President Roosevelt when he was in a wheelchair. And there was a different relationship between the media and politicians in that era. And the American people knew that he was confined to a wheelchair, or they knew that he had suffered from polio, but they didn't realize that he was as confined or as disabled as he was. So go ahead. So which monument is this? It looks like the Washington Monument, doesn't it? Absolutely. Can you go ahead and hit it again? This is a monument to Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. Can you go ahead and hit it again? This was funded with private funds, and it has been maintained by the state of Kentucky, which is where Jefferson Davis was born, for many years. And I think since the 1920s, I'm not positive if it's the entire time that the state has it's been part of the state park system. But I mean, you look at it and it's not as tall as the Washington Monument, but I mean, it looks so similar to it. And I remember going there and with my daughters, and I felt the office was closed, the gift shop was closed, and there was Confederate memorabilia there, and I was almost happy that it was closed when we went, but I did want to see it. I mean, it's a historical artifact. So go ahead, and if you can hit that. Interestingly enough, Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis were actually born about 100 miles from one another. So it's an excellent example of this irony, I guess you could say, with the Civil War and just how divisive it was. We've got these two leaders who were in power at that time, and they're from they were born very close to one another. Okay, go ahead. All right. So here's our Confederate flag. What does this convey? What is the meaning of this? Well, for some people, this is an example of heritage, family roots, where they come from. It represents an independent spirit, kind of a rebellion against authority, and that we can have independent thought. It represents states' rights as opposed to the federal government imposing things. And up until, it was about the mid-1990s that the University of Mississippi stopped having people bring the flag in. And I can't remember which of the coaches it was, but you don't generally see it now. And I don't know if it's banned or not, but it was very common to have that flag during football games in particular. For some, it's a symbol of racism. It's a symbol of white supremacy, support for slavery. It's symbolic of treason. The same item and different people have a different emotional attachment or anger, frustration with the same item. But again, what is this actually? Can you go ahead and go to the next? What actually is this flag? It's not the Confederate flag. It's actually, if you look at the square, okay, that's the battle flag of Northern Virginia, General Lee's troops, okay? In a rectangular form beginning in 1863, so 2 years into the Civil War, this was the battle flag of the Army of Tennessee. That's what this was in actuality. Okay, we call it, and I may even refer to it as the Confederate flag, okay, as we go on, but I think that it's important to kind of point this out. So you go to the next one. So there was no one Confederate flag. There were actually three. On the left, you see the stars and bars, okay, the red, white, and then red, and then the circles representing the different states of the Confederacy. Well, that looked so similar to the American flag, this flag of the Confederacy, okay, that they changed it to the stars and bars and actually the stainless banner. And then that would get, there was so much white and it would get dirty in that. So then for maybe the last couple of months of the war, we have the blood-stained banner. So actually, there were three Confederate flags, and you see the evolution of those here. So go ahead. So I said that I would come back to this slide, all right? It's complicated. This flag represents so much to different people and diametrically opposed viewpoints. And again, who was in power? Okay, again, I want you to keep thinking of this. And what was the purpose? Okay, all right, so go ahead. So I happen to be a member of the Organization of American Historians. There are other organizations, professional organizations, but one of the things is that, and I wanted to root some of this in the statements of these organizations that either I'm a member of or I respect. And so one thing to point out, when it comes to the monuments dealing with the Civil War, it's not as if the Civil War ended in 1865 and you see the next 5 years lots of monument building. That's not true generally. Same is true after the end of Reconstruction. So the Union troops occupied southern states until 1877. Okay, so for 12 years after the war. And in many ways, it wasn't just after that, after those Union troops left, that had established martial law in many of those states. It was really beginning in the 1890s up to the 1920s, roughly 30, 40-year era where most of these were put into place, and that's when they were created. And the focus, okay, and the reason of this is that this was intended to intimidate African Americans. The Supreme Court issued its Plessy v. Ferguson court case in 1896. That was a separate but equal and allowed for segregation in public places. And so a lot of these were created in this, this window of 1890s to 1920s. But then we see in the 1950s, for some reason, this reprise in Confederate imagery. Go ahead, if you can hit the next.
We lost the Zoom connection for a minute, so I'm trying to get that back.
Okay. This, it was really after World War II, and particularly late 1940s and into the 50s, that you see a reprise or a renewed interest in, I'll just say, the Confederate flag. Or, technically it's this battle flag of Northern Virginia. But so why then? Well, that coincided with the Civil Rights Movement. As many veterans of the Second World War came back and they said, we fought against fascism and we want to live in a representative democracy. And they began to assert their rights, particularly through the court system. People responded. And so it became increasingly, the Confederate flag became increasingly linked with opposition to integration and the context of the Civil Rights Movement. And you can see some of the imagery here on the left. Can you go ahead and go to the next? Now, I just wanted to jump ahead a little bit, I'm sure you've heard of the Convoy in Canada, and particularly in Ottawa. And then, there's this Confederate flag, with the truck in it. And so they've incorporated that. And what I would say, I don't know why, okay, but because I dug around and I tried to find an interview. What I think is, how I said that for some, this represents an independent spirit. It represents states' rights, individual rights, okay? And so I think that's the message that's being conveyed here. But it's just kind of interesting. And I tried to find an image. I've heard that there were Nazi flags, like a swastika, I should say, that were associated with this, but I never saw any images. And so, I didn't do an exhaustive study, but here's this one. So go ahead and you can go to the next. It's a repeat, but I just wanted to come back to this, just, after coming to current events. So immediately after World War II and then into the 1950s, we see this reemergence of the Confederate flag. Can you go ahead and hit it again? So what was this? Well, I don't know if you remember Strom Thurmond. He was a long-serving senator from South Carolina. He was a prominent political figure in South Carolina politics for many years, and he ran for president in 1948. He ran, and it was a brand new political party. Traditionally, he had been a Democrat, the Democratic Party was easing in its support for segregation. And so he ran as a Dixiecrat in 1948. And he was a single issue candidate in support of segregation. And so you can see, the focus on states' rights. The White Citizens Council was a white supremacist organization, and you see the American flag combined with the Confederate flag as they're running. So you can go ahead and hit it again. And so that's where you see this reprise. Well, let's look at some of these state flags. Okay, on the bottom left, you see the Georgia state flag. And if you remember that Confederate flag, you can see some influence there from that. And then in the 1950s, you see in response to the Brown versus Board of Education court case that called for the integration of schools in the United States with all deliberate speed, you see that they included the stars and bars. And then in 2004, they revised the state flag, and you can see it there. Can you go to the next? It's kind of interesting when you do a side-by-side between the current flag and the one of the Confederate flags historically. So go ahead. So in Mississippi, so you can see again, another image of another state's flag. This was adopted in 1894, and it incorporated aspects of that Confederate flag as well as that flag of Northern Virginia. Go ahead. All right, so those are like with flags, and you see some things with some of these states' flags. We'll come back to the flags, but I did want to mention something. The Liberty Monument in New Orleans. I'm actually going to New Orleans spring break this year. Very excited to go, but I will not be able to see this. I'll tell you why in a minute. So there was a lot of conflict between Democrats and Republicans in the 1870s. And there was a disputed election in 1874. And what happened is that both sides accused the other of cheating, and both sides claimed victory. For a time, there was a white supremacist group, the White League, overthrew the Republican governor, and they had their own state legislature for a while, and they operated for a short time until federal troops sent in by President Ulysses S. Grant disbanded them. But there was a literal fight and conflict where 100 people were injured and over 30 were killed. And this took place in 1874, this conflict over this disputed election between Democrats and Republicans. And 20 some years later, or nearly 20 years later, this monument was erected in New Orleans. And it was originally on Canal Street. 1891 is when it was set up. Okay, go ahead and go to the next. So this was in honor of this event, this conflict. So in 1932, it's interesting. So there was an original monument, 1891. And then this monument changed over time. In 1932, an inscription was added. U.S. troops took over the state government and reinstated the usurpers, but the national election in November recognized literally white supremacy in the South and gave us our state back. One would, if you want to continue, it's not part of it, but that's, I think, could be the context. This was very controversial over the years. And then by the 1990s, a new inscription was added to honor the Americans on both sides who died. And we should learn our lesson from the past. So that was added in the 1890s. Can you go to the next? in the 1980s, I know this isn't strictly chronological, but I kind of wanted to see that shift there. In the 1980s, it was moved because just, they're redoing some of the roads and that. And they knew that this was really controversial. So it was moved to a less prominent location. And that's when the white supremacy language was taken off. Okay, it was removed. And in 1993, it was voted by the city council to be a public nuisance. And that's when that new inscription was put into place. And then by 2016, it had just again and again, it had been covered with anti-racist graffiti, and they finally decided to remove it. And it is my understanding that it's still in storage. Okay, wasn't destroyed, but it's still in storage. Okay, and so I don't have a date on that photo, but I think it was from the 90s. Okay, go ahead. So I said kind of at the beginning that these are artifacts, and I'm uncomfortable destroying artifacts as a historian. And you'll see some things here, but what do we do with them? How do we address it? Again, I'd like to come back to that. We're back to flags, okay? And this was a flag at the Alabama State House in 1961, in honor of the 100th anniversary of the start of the Civil War. The Confederate flag was flown. Then they took it down. But then after one of those Kennedys came and met with Governor Wallace in hopes of enrolling an African-American student at the University of Alabama, it was flown again. It was there for about 30 years, moved to a different location, but then it was removed in 2015. I'll go ahead to the next. Again, South Carolina, first flown 100th anniversary of the Civil War. Then they moved it to a different location. It was flown at the State House, above the State House. Then it was removed to the state grounds in 2000. But then, not at the State House like above it, but then it was removed completely in 2015. So who was in power? What message were they trying to say? Both in the case of South Carolina as well as the case of Alabama, we see 2015, what's going on here? Go ahead to the next. Oh, if you remember, Dylan Roof went to I believe it was a Baptist church, and he shot several individuals. He hoped to start a race war, and here we see him with the Confederate flag. And so it was within the context of Dylan Roof's actions that we see states reconsidering if they would have the Confederate flag as around their grounds, or whether they would remove it. And I remember Haley, Governor Haley, Nikki Haley, thank you, how adamant she was, and she got a lot of flack for removing the Confederate flag. But she said, hey, this is the right thing to do. Really kind of interesting. So go ahead. And I guess I didn't need to put this in again because I was just kind of stressing, but I think its context is really important when things are put in, when these monuments are created, why they're created, who created them, and in the case of these flags in 2015, why they're being removed. Okay, it's the context of events is really important. Okay, so go ahead. So what happened in 2015, 2016 in the aftermath of this? Okay, I don't know if you remember the Dukes of Hazzard, 1980s TV show. I didn't really watch it that much, but it was very popular, and a lot of reruns and that. Well, the car that they drove was literally named the General Lee, and we see, on top of the hood of the car is the Confederate flag. Okay, go ahead. And TV, I guess I should say, the question was, TV Land was pulled it. And so were they going too far in some of this reaction? And if I remember correctly too, it was like Mattel. If if I remember correctly, they sold the little cars. You know how you can, I remember Adam 12. Okay, I had an Adam 12 little car. Okay, and so when I was a kid. And so there were kids who they sold little cars, but they were generalese. They pulled those off the shelves. I'll be honest with you, and I don't know if they still are off the shelves or not, but for a time they did. So go ahead. Thanks. So let's complicate matters. Let's complicate it even more, okay? And I touched on this a little bit last week, and I know that some of the same people are here, but if I can just go ahead, slavery existed in every single English colony, every single one, including the New England colonies. Okay? And the Constitution protected slavery. Slaves were considered 3/5 of a human being. All white people were considered one, like for the census, whether you were male, female, adult, landowner, infant, you were one if you were white. If you were a slave, you were 60% of a human being, or 3/5 of a person. Native Americans weren't counted at all in the initial census. So slavery was legal in the original 13 states and colonies. Slowly during that era of the American Revolution, as they were talking about being enslaved by the British and freedom and liberty, you see in areas in states where slavery was not as an important part of the economy as it was in others, you see slavery slowly and in a handful of places being prohibited by states. But even by the 1850s, okay, you can see there were 15 slave states, and there's a 31-star flag, so there were 31 states and 15 were slave states. Slavery made up a huge part of the US economy, and in fact, it was the #1 export. By the eve of the Civil War, if I remember correctly, 60% of US exports came from cotton. And cotton was primarily produced in the South, and it was primarily produced by slave labor. Earlier, rice plantations had been common, like in South Carolina and parts of Georgia, but really the cotton economy really exploded, beginning about the 1820s or so, and just grew exponentially after the popularization of the cotton gin, and I'm sure you know. But 60% of US exports, cotton, raw cotton, getting shipped to textile mills, largely to the British, not exclusively. But that's a really strong part of the US economy. And so, slavery may have only been legal in the so-called, south of the Mason-Dixon line, but there's a lot of compliance nationwide as well. So go ahead. And, we like to point to Abraham Lincoln as the great emancipator, and we should, okay? But, and Lincoln had always been very morally opposed to slavery, but in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, when he was debating Stephen Douglas in 1858, he declared that he was not, nor had he ever been, in favor of bringing in any way the social and political equality of white and black races. If Abraham Lincoln had not gone to a play in 1865, or if he had survived the end of the Civil War, would he have supported what became the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote for black men? Probably. But we see his views really shifted over time. I mean, he said, I will not do anything about where slavery is legal. At the beginning of the Civil War, I just don't want it to expand. He would allow slavery to remain where it was legal, but was opposed to slavery's expansion. Well, after the appalling death rates, 2 years, a year and a half or so, I guess I should say, into the Civil War, he changed his position. His position evolved on the issue of slavery. I suspect, but again, we don't know for sure, but I suspect his position on social equality and voting rights probably would have evolved as well. But we don't know that for sure. Go ahead. Okay, so I don't know if, how well you'll be able to see these. But those are historical examples, and if we come to more contemporary ones now, we have some tweets from President Trump. And so on this whole issue of Confederate monuments, names, things like that, he's saying the beauty is being taken out of our cities. Towns and parks will greatly will be missed, and these things will never be replaced. You can't change history, but you can learn from it. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, who's next? Washington, Jefferson? So foolish. Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments. Okay, so that was President Trump. I guess I don't have a date on those, but that was, it's like 2017, 2018, 2019. It was when he was in the White House, of course. What's that? Yeah, yeah. And bottom right, here, we definitely need to remember this period of our history, but there's a big difference between remembering and then building monuments to people. Okay. And for those people who took up arms, whether it's Robert E. Lee or someone else, people who take up arms against the United States government, I mean, that's the very definition of treason. Okay. Yet there are monuments and there are celebrations to many individuals. Okay. And so that's what this historian is getting at here, or law professor. Go ahead. If you can hit the next. It's complicated. Okay. All right. I mean, really, what do we do? This is difficult. It's part of our history. It's part of our heritage. These are archival pieces. Okay. But then what's the message? What were they trying to do? And what I would also say is there's no single solution. I don't think one size definitely does not fit all. So go ahead. This is kind of interesting just from a few years ago. There was a family in Flint and they had a Nazi, swastika, and they had a Confederate flag. But this was located on private property, private property. Okay. And a neighbor says, I don't think that's a good idea. Okay. The property owner did not want to comment. But I would argue, and I guess I'm allowing my own views to come in here a little bit, but I think there's a big difference between a state house, between the grounds of a state legislature or a Capitol building, and somebody's private property, because this is free speech. Okay, this is most definitely free speech. Okay, go ahead. Remember that what I said, who was in power and what was going on at the time? Well, here, during the American Revolution, all right, where there were statues of George III were being ripped down. I think this is the one in New York, which is pretty famous. So it was put up during one era by one group to send a message. Okay. And it was torn down by another group to send a message. Okay. And so we see that here. This isn't in one of the slides, but Christianity was prohibited. It was illegal in the Roman Empire. You were not supportive of traditional Roman values if you were a Christian. Okay. The Romans had their gods. Okay. And if you wanted to have your gods, that's all right, but you need to worship the Roman gods. And one of those commandments for Christians and for Jews was, well, there's only one God and you can't have any false ones. And so followers of Judaism and Christianity came into conflict with the Roman Empire. Well, then Constantine declared that Christianity would be legal and you could practice Christianity. And then 20, 40 years later, Theodosius says, well, no, there's an official religion of the Roman Empire now, and it's Christianity. And so they destroyed, in that Roman era, they destroyed many pagan, quote unquote, pagan artifacts because those were pagan and you're not supposed to have any false gods. And so you see that during that Roman Empire. Go ahead. I was lucky enough to travel to Dachau, which was the largest concentration camp in Germany itself. There were 30,000 people who were executed there. Well, executed and died, I guess. And on the right, we see ovens that were put into place in order to destroy the bodies, to cremate the bodies. How did Germany deal with the Holocaust and in this era of their history? Well, they could have just torn this down and destroyed it, but instead they made it, this concentration camp became a museum of remembrance. And there was an attempt to try to tell a fuller picture, or a fuller story, I should say, that's a better way to put it, with this. And so it's this museum. Okay, now go ahead. And one other thing, that I think is interesting, during the Soviet era, the Soviet Union had all sorts of statues, whether it was Marx or there were other Soviet leaders that were in Russia and other parts of the Soviet Union, but also in Eastern Europe. There were many monuments to celebrate communism and different leaders. And so what happened is that many of those statues post 1989 and largely in the 1990s, those were removed. Some were destroyed, okay, but many of them were removed, and then they were collected in an outdoor museum, and it's got over 40 statues from that communist era. If you can go ahead. And so this was a commentary on dictatorship and tyranny. And so you can see the large one there. And so it's just kind of an interesting twist, on this. They did not destroy all of those because they're historical artifacts, and they created this outdoor museum. One thing, I don't know how I'm doing on time here, so I don't want to keep people too late. One thing, just a little side story. There was in Moscow, there was a very large cathedral. It was called Cathedral of Christ the Savior. Well, Lenin famously said, religion is the opiate of the masses. Okay, all right. So what he wanted to do was he wanted to replace the icons. Again, if you think of Russia, and the Russian Orthodox Church, there were lots of different icons. He wanted to replace the icons, religious icons, with communist icons. And for lack of a better word, that he had the Cathedral of Christ the Savior destroyed. And then this ended up being in the Stalin era after Lenin died. Stalin had plans to build, for lack of a better word, a hall of fame, not of baseball, but of communists. And so right on the location for where this cathedral was, the plans were to build this big monument to communism, and to have at the very top of that a huge statue of Lenin. That was the plan. But then they started to build it and they had problems, and it turned into a big, huge swimming pool. Because that's what they could have. And then after the fall of the Soviet Union, they got rid of the swimming pool and they rebuilt the Cathedral of Christ the Savior. And artists from all over donated different paintings and mosaics and things like that, and they rebuilt it. And I was able to visit it. It was really awesome. So again, if you think back to that theme of who is in power and what are they trying to create? Okay, why build a big cathedral? Well, there was a person in power who wanted to use the church, okay, as this great symbol, okay, to unite the Russian people. Well, then they destroy the religion. They try to replace it with some other imagery. So anyway, go ahead. This one I think is really kind of interesting. And so this is at Saratoga. Battle of Saratoga was a very important battle during the Revolutionary War. Okay, and so this commemorates the most brilliant soldier of the Continental Army who was wounded at this spot, and he helped to win a decisive battle in the American Revolution. but the guy's name isn't listed anywhere because this guy who led this battle and who was injured was Benedict Arnold. And so I just find that really amazing. It was put into place in 1877. So you're thinking, this is right at the end of Reconstruction. And so they're trying to maybe go back to maybe unite the country, as a unifying thing. During the Revolutionary War, this was important, but they didn't put the name of someone who committed treason on the monument to the guy. So again, just kind of an interesting mix here. Go ahead. And I touched a little bit on this last week, but I don't think I said this. So the first time I went to Monticello, I remember I asked about Sally Hemings and they were very forthcoming. The next time I went to Monticello, they had displays and they had the full story of Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. Because in 1990, I think it was 98, that's when the DNA evidence showed 99.9% chance that Jefferson had fathered at least one of the children of Sally Hemings' children. And then there's also, what's it called? Something Row. Anybody been to Mulberry Row? No, I don't think so. The slavery at Monticello is an important part of the visitor experience now. And it's not as if they didn't deny anything initially, but it's telling a fuller story, I would argue. Go ahead. And so here's the Mississippi state flag, okay, from 1894. We'll go ahead. I showed this earlier. Go ahead to the next one. And so in June of 2020, Mississippi State's legislature said, okay, let's have a new design for a flag. And they had a commission that was established and people could submit entries. Committee looked at it. And then in November of 2020, so just a short time ago, they voted overwhelmingly to accept the new design. But why in 2020 was this happening? Go ahead. Okay. Well, there was the murder of George Floyd, and there were the protests in different areas in different communities. And so again, it's back to that idea of what's going on, who's in power, what message are they trying to convey? Go ahead. Okay, so I had said before, private property is one thing. Okay, but how can you have a Confederate flag at a state house or something like that? Well, here's one. Okay, this is at the Texas state capitol. And what it does is it represents the different eras after European exploration and settlement in Texas. Okay, it's a historical display. So upper left, there's the flag when Texas was under Spanish control, then for a short time under French, then under Mexico, then Texas was its own country. It was the Lone Star Republic. And if you hear that Texas is the Lone Star State, okay, it was its own country for what, about 10 years, just under 10 years. And then part of the Confederacy, okay, and then Texas in the United States. So I find this, I think this is an interesting display showing this. It does not include anything prior to European exploration, but it does have that long historical era after Spanish explorers were there in Texas. Go ahead. So again, the AHA and some statements. So these images are still being invoked. If you do remove them, it doesn't change history or erase it. Okay, even historians disagree as to what we should do exactly. But different communities might face decisions. They're saying, hey, we're an organization that has some background here. Why don't if you want some information, if you can seek some facts and chronology, we would provide it. And all of these memorials are artifacts. And like other things, we shouldn't just, we wouldn't destroy letters. I'll show you something here in a minute. We shouldn't rip up letters and put them in the toilet. That's, or documents, or just put them in a shredder. So it's, you know, it's preserving this, you know, like in Hungary where they took those statues and they put them in one location. So go ahead. And so, if anything, you know, this is complicated, all right? And there's no one size fits all, and maybe different groups trying to see where we should move forward. What should we do? What's the best thing is to try to get as much input from the public and then try to make an informed decision. So if you can go ahead and then go again. I decided I wasn't sure exactly what I should do here, but just to kind of make sure that, you know, this idea of artifacts. So I was lucky enough a few years back, I got a grant and I spent a week in Georgia at the Georgia Historical Society the Georgia Historical Society with 20 other historians who teach at community colleges. And we had the ability to do a little bit of research. And I was looking through the finding aids and I said, oh gosh, there's a Ku Klux Klan constitution here. So I was like, I want to look at it. And they were all, well, they weren't all, but several of them were like, why do you want to look at that? And I said, are you kidding me? Shouldn't we, you know, read this stuff and explore and that? Because of course, do we just leave Nazi Germany out of the history books? I mean, you know, it may be something that I disagree with, but I wanted to find out more. And so I was able to look at this Ku Klux Klan Constitution from the 1920s. I'll be honest and say I don't know the exact year, but I know it was from the 20s. Okay. And they had their dedication. And so at the very front, it said, we are dedicated to Almighty God, to the teachings of Jesus Christ, our Lord, to the United States of America, and to the maintenance of white supremacy. And so I don't know if people are aware of this or not, but the Ku Klux Klan was very common in the South in the 1860s, 1870s, you know, and beyond. Okay. And then it kind of died out in many ways. Well, in the 1920s, there was a resurgence in the Ku Klux Klan, in part like an opposition to immigration. That was one of the biggies. 100% Americanism was the motto. And in the 1920s, well, it wasn't just them. There was a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment in the 20s, and Congress passed legislation limiting immigration to the United States. Prior to the 1920s, if you were from Japan or if you were from China, it might be difficult to immigrate to the United States, but from any place else, it was an open door policy essentially, until the National Origins Act passed in 1924. Okay. But this is in Georgia. This was a Georgia group. Can you go to the next? So the Clark Historical Library at Central Michigan University has an outstanding archive, and I was doing some work on my current project, and for years I wanted to just look through something. So in the about 15 years ago, the Clark purchased some Ku Klux Klan items. What happened is there was a Klan leader who lived in Nagle County, and he had a lot of correspondence. At one point, he was like the treasurer, and so he corresponded with people from all over the state of Michigan and at times in different parts of the country. And so he had this house, had all of these records and cards. There's like membership cards for the Ku Klux Klan. And he had all these lists and correspondence and some robes and other items. Okay. So he ended up putting them up in his attic, forgot about them. And then the house was sold. And I think it might have still stayed in the family, but I'm not sure. But anyway, in the 1990s, I think it was in the 90s, the house was being sold and somebody said, oh my gosh, what's up here in the attic? And they sold it. And the Clark purchased a lot of this correspondence. Okay. And I'd wanted to see this just to look through it to see I wonder if there's anyone here from Mason or Manistee counties. I mean, literally, that's what I wanted to do. So if you go to the next. I don't know if you can see this very well. So this is from the Clark and from this collection. And, you know, this is from, so Lewis Capon was the man who had these items. Okay. And, you know, the name here, MacArthur, isn't important. And I wish I had a thing here, but look at the very top. This is from August 1928. But if you go a little higher, it says Senate. State of Michigan, Lansing. So a member of the state legislature who was a senator wrote this, and it says, I find the difficulties of a brother Klansman is such that I will not be able to make any kind of campaign for the office of lieutenant governor. He was maybe going to try to go for lieutenant governorship. But here, using his state senator letterhead, okay, he's writing to a member of the Ku Klux Klan. So he was, you know, a member, and he was a state senator. Go ahead. So I also was looking around, you know, for this, and this is a letter. I found two people from, well, one from Mason County, one from Manistee County. I looked through a bunch of stuff. So this is from a guy named J.A. Hubble, who was from Scottville. And he starts off with, my faithful, good, and esteemed Klansman, and continues on. And so this was one piece of correspondence from somebody from Mason County. If you go to the next. And then here's another from Ralph J. Peterson, again from Manistee. So to my faithful and esteemed Klansmen. Again, it's what's written, I don't think is necessarily all that crucial, but just the fact that there was this correspondence from somebody from Mason and Manistee County, because sometimes we say, oh gosh, you know, those Southerners, they're you know, that's just, you know, these attitudes and this, and it makes me uncomfortable, but this is our backyard. And then if you go one more, this is a Ku Klux Klan rally, kind of a famous one locally. There wasn't a huge KKK membership, I don't think, in Mason County, but there was. There was a little bit larger one in Oceana County. And so you see when Max Tyler died, there was a procession at his funeral, and many of his fellow Klansmen wore their garb through the streets of Hart. And I think, I don't know this for sure, but I think that's kind of the road, you know, where La Fiesta restaurant is. I think it's kind of like, it would be on the corner there, on the left. Yeah, I don't know that for sure. I don't, however, but that's in Hart, and that was what, October of 1924. Okay. So if you go ahead. So anyway, these are just some of the things that I wanted to share this evening. And, you know, I just want to kind of stress that there's no single answer. This is a difficult subject. I also think that as a historian, I'm uncomfortable with destroying things. That they really are artifacts, but there's no single solution necessarily in every case. So, does anyone have any questions? Yes, Deb, sure.
Hello. Okay, Mike, this is not a question. I remember very clearly when those items were found in Nagle. And I think it was in the 80s. It was pre-cable news. And if I remember the story correctly, a family bought the house outside of the prior family who owned it. And the material was found in the attic behind a false wall. And it made national news. And they decided after many months of debate, what should we do with it? What should we do with it? To hold an auction. And the auction drew thousands of people, and all three network newses came and covered it. And I have some pretty crazy photos from that. There was a lot of anticipation when came time to auction off the robes and the hoods, how they would display it. And what they ended up doing is someone walked around with a hood, with his hand up in the hood. You know, nobody wore anything. But it was all afternoon, and like I said, thousands of people there. It was really interesting. And I'll try and dig up some of those photos and show them to you.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know that CMU received criticism from some people, like, why are you spending, and it's, you know, CMU is a publicly funded institution, while they do have, you know, donors in that. But it was to preserve the history, and there were these magazines, you know, if you join the Ku Klux Klan, you get a card, and then you can also get the Ku Klux Klan doll, and you can get the KKK this and the KKK that. And so I've seen some of those catalogs, and so I just found that pretty amazing. Yeah.
Did you want to continue? Go ahead.
I just, during this time, my mom was born in 1922. And again, during this time when all these artifacts were found in Newaygo, it was the talk of all counties around. And she and I were having a conversation one day, and she remembered, she was from Chicago and she was Catholic. And they had a summer home down in the Whitehall area. And she remembered when she was a child, that the Klan was active, but they were against Catholics.
Mhm.
And there were people in her families in her neighborhood that because she was Catholic, they wouldn't let their children play with her.
Yep. Yep.
I have
So
one
there's a
chat. Well,
question, huh?
Kathy, you can take to Chuck. Let me just read this comment from, and it follows up what you had to say. This person, Carmelita Tiffany, says, Mike, you are correct about the heart photo. This is looking south on State Street with your back to Hart,
Oh, okay. All right.
to Hart Lake.
Yep. Okay.
What do you think about the statues in a military park such as Gettysburg? You know, General Lee on top of Traveler, where Pickett's charge started. I mean, to me, that's history. I agree with you on the history part, but still, it could segue into that type of those statues also.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, he was there, you know, Lee was there, and Traveler was his horse. And so, you know, that's my knee jerk. I've been to Gettysburg. I can't remember. It was really quick. My daughters were really young and they were hating it the entire time. They called it Getty's boring. We took them to so many historical sites. Oh my gosh. But anyway, my reaction to that is, I mean, he was there. And so, and there are other monuments, and, you know, there's a fuller picture there.
Each
So-
state put their own monument up to their fallen soldiers. I mean, to them, it's honoring the dead at the battlefield more than anything else, but it could go into those type of
Right.
situations. I think a lot of these monuments should be put into museums. If somebody wants to pay to go see them, that's fine. Just like that, the park.
Mhm.
And, you know, if somebody wants to pay to see them, fine, but, and I know I've talked to people about this before. I don't know what it's like to go past the statue of somebody who suppressed me.
Mhm. Right, absolutely.
I mean,
What
I'm
kind
sure,
of,
you know, I can understand that. And as a young kid, the battle flag was just, to me, it was part of the history.
Mhm.
And then it became, well, it's a symbol for, you know, being a rebel.
Yep.
And not necessarily the suppression of the blacks.
Sure.
And then you look at the Native Americans, look at all the monuments we've got around, and I'm sure they're probably walking by going, you know, these people took my land.
Right. So that's why I say it's complicated. Yeah. And you know, when I was in high school, I was taught that the Civil War was about states' rights. That's what I was taught. Then I went to college, and I remember like a graduate class. And what we did, we talked about all the reasons why there were for the Civil War: social reasons, economic reasons, states' rights, you know, tariff, should it be high, should it be low, slavery and all that. But everything essentially had as a foundation, and it was slavery. And if you look at the statements by Alexander Stevens, he's the vice president of the Confederacy. His is maybe the most famous where, I mean, he's just like, we are fighting for white supremacy. I didn't bring that with me today, and so I'm not quoting it. I'm paraphrasing. We are here to preserve slavery. I mean, it is crystal clear. Yes, states' rights was an issue, but it's because of slavery. And you just look at, I mean, as each state left the Union, they rejected the United States Constitution, and then they adopted a new one, and the word slave or slavery appears again and again and again and again in these statements. So, yeah. And by the way, the Catholic, and it was, in Oregon, the teaching of Catholic schools were basically prohibited in the 1920s in Oregon. It was against private schools, but it was Catholic. And so that would be an extreme case, but absolutely it was, there was a questioning of Catholics because are they going to be loyal to the United States or are they going to be loyal to the Pope? And just for full disclosure, I was raised Catholic, went to Catholic schools. It was Sister Laureen Heck who taught that it was states' rights, not slavery, that caused the Civil War, I should say. I totally remember her. She was a great teacher, but and she would, probably admit that, but I totally remember that with Sister Laureen. So, yeah.
Don't have any further questions yet on chat. Anyone else here in the audience?
So we got Sue.
Yeah, so I'm just curious as a historian and someone who spent time looking at this and thinking about it. What do you think about reparations?
Yeah. How one goes across it, I don't know. It's and you know what? Okay, so I'm a white guy, here too. I mean, we talk about. You asked about Robert A. Lee and Traveler at Gettysburg. I'm a white guy, grew up on the West Coast, live in the Great Lakes now. Here, and I've got my baggage and my own perspective in that, and so Yeah, I have no idea how to resolve that. But one thing that I would say, okay, so I say this to students, I say, what would have happened if I had been born with black skin? If my family was. And so like if my parents, were black, they were both born in 1936. They would have, my dad and my mom had basically community college education. My mom was a nurse and my dad was a court reporter. And we can, I was a white middle-class family, grew up right in Seattle, in a middle-class neighborhood, maybe upper middle-class neighborhood. My dad died when I was 13. And so that was devastating for our family. But right next door to us was the vice president of a company. And he got me a summer job that paid, that paid for much of my college. And so that was something that was amazing for me. Well, what if my family, had black skin? All right. Well, Brown versus Board of Education hadn't been decided yet. So my parents would have gone to segregated schools more than likely. Would they have gone, through 8th grade? Would they have finished high school? Maybe. But would they have gone to college? Because it would have been legal to say, no, you're black, you can't go to college here. And then, would we have lived in a middle-class neighborhood with a vice president of a company right next door? Probably not, for me to have to pay for my college. And so I worked really hard. And it doesn't say that I didn't work really hard for my schooling and to get a job and all that, but there would have, because I have white skin, there were fewer barriers that were making it more difficult for me. Now, again, I'm dancing around your question about reparations, but I do, I just to to say that, just how one person's experience, what would have happened if I had been born with black skin. Maybe I would be here, but there would have been more barriers. So I don't know, just kind of bearing my soul a little bit there.
Thank you. I just, it's good for us to think about this, I think.
Yeah.
Mike, I
I
have a
have-
question back here.
Oh, I have a question from, are you reading the one on chat?
No.
Oh.
no, it's good. I've got one of my own.
Oh, okay.
I'm gonna
Take it
jump in
away,
line
Tom,
for
and I'll
Michael
return to
there.
the one on chat.
And I just wonder, more to think about here is, I used to love the Dukes of Hazzard when I was a kid. I used to walk around, you can hear me calling myself Luke Duke when I was in second grade. But I also love like songs like I've Been Working on the Railroad and other songs that have minstrel origins. And so I wonder if you can comment on how we can move past and still enjoy these things that, you know, we enjoyed. Like, I don't know that I would show my kids the Dukes of Hazzard.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great. So I think number one is having empathy and putting oneself, can I quote Atticus Finch here? And if you've never walked around in somebody else's shoes, I know that I butchered that a little bit, but I think you know what I'm getting at. That simple empathy and an understanding and a knowledge, and I think is a really good starting point. Recognition of things in the past. And yes, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was, 50 years ago. However, that legacy, as I explained it in my own family, that legacy still exists. And so I think that's the starting point. I think history, knowledge, information, and having empathy for different points of view.
The question from Chad is, Mike, please comment on the significance of Idlewild in
Oh.
Lake County.
Sure. Yeah, okay. So Idlewild has a rich history. So it actually started in 1912 with 4 white guys. That era of the early teens was an era where there was the beginnings of the state park system in that, and a little bit of tourism here in Michigan. And so 4 gentlemen got property, and then they started to market it to African Americans. And they did so because African Americans, it wasn't as if there was a huge middle class, but if you were black, you could be denied entry to any place. And whether it was north, south, east, west, whatever. And so they created a niche, and they marketed this to African-American families. And they literally, how you ever hear of a condo spiel? Where you go and they feed you a meal, and sometimes they might let you stay at a hotel like one night or something like that. Well, they literally had buses in Chicago and Indianapolis and other places. They would go to African-American churches and they'd say, okay, do you want to come up for the afternoon? We'll take you here. It is a paradise where everyone is welcome. And they marketed it beginning in the 1912, but then throughout the teens, 1920s, there were several key people who were there. What's the name? Okay, so Daniel Williams was a surgeon, African-American surgeon, and he was actually the first to successfully perform open heart surgery in the United States. He was a black doctor. He owned property there. When he retired in the late 20s, 30s, I can't remember exactly when, but I think he passed away in the 1930s. He had been a full-time resident there for many years. The first millionaire black woman who was a millionaire. There was I'm forgetting her name. I can see her face. There's a
Walker?
Netflix. What's that?
Is it Walker?
Madam C.J. Walker. Okay. She made millions in the hair care products, perfume, beauty products. There's a Netflix series called something, and I can't remember what's that? No. Yeah. So anyway, I didn't like the Netflix series, but because it wasn't as historical. But anyway, so she owned property there, and so Dr. Dan and Madam C.J. Walker, were these prominent people, and Daniel Williams would go throughout the country, and he would go to these, and he would speak about his time as a surgeon, and then he would talk about how if you want a week where you don't have to worry about segregation and Jim Crow, come to Idlewild. And so it became a mecca of tourism for African-American families. And then really, the state of Michigan flourished in the Second World War. So African-Americans, participated as well, not at the same level as whites, but they did. And so it even became a boom area. And then there were traveling musical, and musical groups and dancers. The Four Tops played there. There were many different, I'm trying to think of some of there were many artists performed there. Louis Armstrong came there. Joe Louis, he had a spot where he would work out in between Scottville and Baldwin. And so he would visit over there a little bit. And so this was, it was a happening place. It has been considered the most important African-American resort in the United States. It was part of what was nicknamed the Chitlin Circuit, because they would go to different parts of New England and they would make their way Midwest, and then they would stop in Idlewild. So that's just a bit. And after the Civil Rights Act in 1964 became law, what you see is that there were many more options for African Americans. They didn't have to just go to Idlewild. They could go to Atlantic City. They could go to wherever on a vacation, and so yeah. So it saw a decline.
Maybe we have one last question on chat, and maybe this should take us to the end. And it's a philosophical question, not that any of the others have not been to. What will be done in different regions in the country? My father's family lived as poor dirt farmers for generations in the South, and he was a staunch Confederate sympathizer. He ended up moving to Flint with his cousins to work at the auto factories and still carried his racism with him. I spent many visits biting my tongue, and now I know that, since he's passed now, I regret not speaking up. Will the legacy change as the old folks pass away?
Yeah, great question. I think that each generation has an opportunity, to inform themselves and to come to their own conclusions. I know that my own, my experience is different from my parents, and my daughter's experiences will be different from mine. And so that's one thing that's an opportunity for each generation to be informed and to draw their own conclusions. So yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah.
Well, Mike, thank you very much for this evening. It was provocative and gives us things to continue to think about, not just about the Confederate symbols, but a lot on race and racism. So very aptly done.
Thank you, and appreciate you coming out on a cold evening. So thanks.
And thank you to those. Thank you to those still with us online. Please, folks, here, fill out the surveys and just leave them at the back, and get cookies and coffee if you'd like on the way out. Thank you again, Mike. Very nice job.